Hello YouTube, I am re-recording a video that I just recorded because I felt that I mumbled extensively and was not sufficiently eloquent. So to the one viewer who viewed my video that I just put up prior to me taking it down, view this one instead. What I want to address is the recent so-called uprisings and protests that have been occurring around the world. Most recently, there have been protests in the Ukraine, Ireland, Turkey, Palestine, and I believe that is all. The main notion that I want to undermine is that these are indicative of some spreading of the Middle East revolution, some spreading of the Arab Spring, and that they are fundamental and indicative of something highly positive and have a strong potential for massive societal change. The country I did not mention is Spain, of course. They're having massive protests. And this notion is propagated by the media, by various commentators, and it is accepted by a substantial percentage of the populace, of at least the populace in the U.S. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but this notion that these are liberals primarily, and even radicals to a large degree, whether you're an anarchist or a libertarian quote-unquote conspiracy theorist, most people, even within the fringes, seem to accept this notion that these are really phenomenal things. Really phenomenal that all these people are uprising. And on the one hand, it is excellent that people are standing up to injustice and oppression, and as a consequence of austerity and the economic problems that the elites created, the fact that they're passing them on to the citizenry and making them suffer for it, I feel, certainly it's power to the people, so to speak. It's good that people are resisting in some capacity, but I do question whether even the most recent example of quote-unquote mass protests or a decent number of people resisting is in Spain. And just to summarize that situation briefly, in Spain there are tens of thousands of people that have gathered in Madrid in a central square there and camped out and defied the authorities' orders, somewhat akin to that of what had occurred in Tahrir Square in Egypt. And then various other cities in Spain as well are having smaller but relatively large protests. Now, let's take a look for a moment at what occurred in Egypt to bring some reality to this situation. Now, the situation in Egypt is far from over. The end result, quote-unquote, if there can ever be said to be one, has not been sufficiently, it cannot be gauged at this point. But look at the results so far. 2 million people for weeks. At its peak, 2 million people, and at various other points there were fewer, but a substantial percentage of the Egyptian population, not by any vast stretch of majority, but this was a historical anomaly, that sheer massive number of Egyptians that camped out in Tahrir Square for weeks at a time, despite an extremely oppressive regime, despite the murders and jailings and torturings, etc. And what do we see in terms of change? We see virtually no fundamental societal change. It's hard to tell exactly what's occurring on the ground there, but we have a military that has imprisoned, by some accounts, disappeared approximately 1,000, or, I think it's 10,000 in fact. 10,000 Egyptians disappeared. Let me Google it just for a moment. Be patient with me. No, sorry, it's 1,000. 1,000 individuals have been disappeared by the Egyptian military government since the revolution, since the ousting of President Mubarak. And they're cracking down brutally on protests, peaceful protests, other protests, and the quality of life and the system of government has not fundamentally changed in Egypt. And, if you're realistic and not simply hopey-changey and believe in this doctrine of, everything's going to be good now, if you look at the situation realistically, you could have predicted that. To some extent, I was hopeful, and I'd like to live in a world where being hopeful was actually realistic and things actually change for the better easily, but we don't live in that kind of world. We live in a world where masses of people can resist and still no fundamental change occurs. And, it's to be expected because the military is primarily comprised of former Mubarak officials. These are people that were at high-level positions of an authoritarian, tyrannical, oppressive regime. So what do you expect from them? The sudden emergence of democracy? No. I mean, fortunately, the Egyptians are still protesting and attempting to create some kind of a change, but a lot more is going to be needed. So when we look at the situation in Spain right now, and we see tens of thousands of people, far less than Egypt, still a decent number of people, but far less than Egypt, when we see them resisting, we must recognize that it's going to take a lot for the government to give up their power and institute massive reform. Because the government has a virtual monopoly on the use of force, and they want to preserve the status quo, more so in tyrannical regimes, but all power systems want to preserve their power and want to preserve the status quo. In order for them to implement change, a fundamental threat to the status quo needs to occur. And a fundamental threat to the status quo is not people standing in a street. Now, I admire these people. I think they're doing the right thing, and I think they're well-intentioned, and I think that some of them are much more courageous than I am, especially those in Egypt that are facing the, bullets of the tyrannical Mubarak regime. But I think that it's naive to assume that the government's just going to say, oh, yep, massive change is going to occur as a result of people resisting. It's simply not the case. Yes, they do pose some threat to the status quo by disrupting the economic order and general normal functioning of these countries by standing in the streets and not going about their day-to-day lives to the same degree. Yes, they pose a fundamental some threat to the status quo, but it's not sufficient to enact any kind of fundamental change. And this is evidenced by Egypt, and Tunisia has seen more substantial change, but it's still by no vast stretch anything remotely close to a just society. So I think we need to have no illusions in that regard and think about what these uprisings really mean and what can be done to make sure that they are effective, or at least to increase the chances that they may be effective. Now, the other component of this that I want to address, and the notion that I want to undermine, in addition to this fact that people are just overly optimistic that they'll create fundamental change, is the related fact that people I recently saw a video by James Corbett. Those of you who don't know who he is, he's kind of similar to Alex Jones. He does geopolitical analysis and quote-unquote conspiracy theory, but he's a little more intelligent. He's more intelligent in my view. He's less of an actor. He has a more genuine delivery. I do think Jones believes what he's talking about, but he is a little bit sensationalist. That can't be denied. I no longer think Jones is quote-unquote paranoid, because if you look at the world today, it's a hellish place, and I don't think it's really possible to overstate that. But I'm digressing. James Corbett, he has a different approach, a different delivery style, and he's, I think, more rational and more intelligent than Jones. But I really did take issue with his recent video in which he showed videos of various different protests that are occurring around the world right now. He talked about the Spain uprising. He talked about protests in Ireland, the Ukraine, Turkey, Palestine, and even the U.S., and cited them, or at least very strongly implied, that they're part of this general trend towards global revolution, this general trend towards people wanting freedom. And I'm mildly surprised, because Corbett is typically rather cynical, aka realistic, but he cited, I think it was just a few thousand people in Ireland. There was a protest against the banks that had hundreds or maybe a few thousand at most people in the U.S. There were, I don't know, between a few hundred and a few thousand people in Turkey protesting government repression against the Kurds there, the Kurdish ethnic group. And I'd like to just bring into awareness the fact that protests do occur all the time. whether it's for gay rights or austerity, or or not for austerity, but whether it's resisting austerity, pro-gay rights, anti-war. Um, I think that there's a tendency to associate a lot of unrelated protests with the uprisings in the Middle East that just occurred, and likening it to some general societal trend, when the fact that there's a protest with a few thousand people in the United States is not indicative that they were motivated by the Egyptians who were resisting Mubarak. Okay, it's more likely to be indicative of just general people get upset for a variety of reasons, many of which are legitimate in the United States all the time. Certainly there is more momentum, and certainly the scale of the protests in the Middle East have been unprecedented, or have been a rare occurrence in history that we see that many people resisting in that fashion. And certainly the austerity measures and the collapse of the global economy is creating more resistance. But that doesn't justify likening a protest of a few thousand people in Washington, D.C. to some kind of, massively positive occurrence. Again, if 2 million Egyptians couldn't fundamentally alter their society by standing and gathering together and holding signs and chanting, a few thousand people in the U.S. are not going to do so. And another example would be the fact that 1 million people in the U.S. and I believe 2 million people in London protested when the Iraq invasion was announced, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, in March of 2003. And, the government simply does not care in and of itself that people stage large protests. The status quo needs to be threatened. They need to deem it in their best interest to alter society substantially. If it is not in their best interest in terms of their ability to maintain power, then they simply are not going to fundamentally change things. So I would just caution people against this naive, Obama-supporting-esque approach, similar to the Obama supporters in the sense that it's just overly optimistic given the state of things, to simply assume that the protests in the Middle East and in Ireland and various locations around the world are phenomenal things that will result in great societal changes, etc. And I would caution people against assuming that all protests that occur are part of the austerity, anti-austerity protests and part of some sort of a global trend just because they're occurring at the same time. So that's all I have. I mean, I certainly hope that these Spain protests do result in societal change, and I hope that the protesters can, from a tactical standpoint, understand what will result in massive societal change. I do commend them. I do support their intentions, etc. But I just caution against this naive approach and assumption that change is easy when you have governments and government thugs, aka police, who will brutally attempt to uphold the status quo and will attempt to channel resistance into acceptable limited means, and will attempt to do whatever they can to limit the power of the resistance and limit the extent to which fundamental societal change is possible. So thanks for listening, and I will talk to you people through this computer, because in the near future, if I am so inclined. So thanks for listening.